Well, welcome. The silly season is upon us. The season where you really have to take your hats off to people who not only have ideas, but are willing to stand up and fight for them and help us make Milford what it's always been and what we want it to be. Well, as a matter of fact, now that we're sitting 8 feet apart, we can take the masks off. We'll have to put them back on when we leave. So tonight, we're going to talk to a candidate for what I believe is the most important position in the town. We always look at different officers of the town, but you forget that anybody who's had a child, if you're lucky when they get to high school, you grab an hour a day, maybe an hour and a half, and the school committee members get to decide what your child does for 6 hours a day minimum. So it's an amazing responsibility. It's an amazing amount of work. And tonight we're going to talk to somebody who's not only willing to give her opinion, but to get up and try and make it happen so we get a better Milford. So why don't we start with an introduction?
Yes, thank you. My name is Robyn Bratica. I'm a lifelong Milford resident. I graduated from Milford High School, class of 2002. After high school, I went to college at St. Michael's College up in Burlington, Vermont, where I studied psychology. And after that, I went to graduate school at the University of Rhode Island, where I received my Master's of Arts and then my PhD in school psychology. Currently, I'm an assistant professor of school psychology and the director of the Master's of Arts and Certificate of Advanced Graduate Study program of school psychology at William James College. But prior to that, I actually worked in the Milford Public Schools. So for 3 years, I was both the school psychologist and the adjustment counselor at Middle School East. I'm dual licensed in both of those areas. And then once Middle School East closed, which was a really sad day, I went over to Stacy Middle School, where I worked as a special education team chairperson for 2 years. That's a really interesting position because you're in a leadership role, but not an administrative role. But regardless, I thought being in that role, I should go for an administrative license too. So I am also licensed as a superintendent and assistant superintendent provisionally through the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. So all of that aside, the most important thing about me is that I'm a mom to an 8-year-old girl who's in 2nd grade at Brookside Elementary.
What a wonderful age.
Yes, it is. She's very active, so she keeps me on my toes, but every day she amazes and inspires me.
I was always fortunate because my sainted mother lived with us.
Mm-hmm.
So we had 2 daughters, and it was 3 against 2. So we could almost keep up.
Yep. There you go, keeping the ratios good.
Robyn, I'll start the show with the same question I always start and end with. I'm from Milford. Why should I vote for you?
Yeah, that's great. So like I said, I'm a mom. And so the decisions that the school committee makes aren't just abstract ideas to me. I'm very vested in the decisions and the discussions that happen. So for me, it wouldn't be a couple meetings a month I attend and then I just move on with the other pieces of my life. This impacts my family. It impacts my daughter. So I am very dedicated to what the school committee would be doing, the decisions they would be making, the policies that they would be influencing. That is something that I care deeply about. I also have a very long-standing commitment to service, in particular related to education. So back when I was in high school, I volunteered for the Special Olympics with Jen Walsh. After my track practices, I would volunteer. And now it's very satisfying for me that my daughter is now part of this same program that I volunteered for when I was just a kid myself. I've worked with different community organizations. When I was in college, I actually did a service learning trip that brought me to a high school to work with disadvantaged youth in Florida, and that really sparked for me my interest in education. So my service to education runs deep. Currently professionally, I'm on the editorial board of the Journal of School Psychology, where I conduct peer reviews, and then personally, I've been on the Shining Star PTO board, as well as the Milford CPAC, the Special Education Parent Advisory Council board as well. This year, I've been getting more involved with my daughter's PTO. I recently had a meeting with Principal Elmore about the school council, and so just really being involved in education in my town, in my daughter's education is important to me. And I do feel with my experience and my own education that I just offer a unique lens. And I've spent 8 years advocating for my own child, and now I just would like the opportunity to help advocate for all of the children in Milford. So I hope I get that chance.
Well, we're always talking about that. Everybody says, I got a daughter, I got a son. You're coming up to a position where you'll have 4,500 children that belong to you
Yep.
to take care of.
Yep.
When you look at the school system, what do you think the three biggest challenges you'll be facing will be?
Yeah, so right now, coming off of everything that's happening with the pandemic and the fact that we have masks here today, right? So we're still in the pandemic. One of the things that I think can't be stated enough is the impact this could potentially have on the mental health, not only of our students, but also of the personnel working in the schools. And just to explain what I mean by that. Right now, working in the field of psychology, especially with children, there aren't outpatient clinicians readily available. So what does that mean? That means that there's one place where kids can reliably be getting the mental health services that they need, and that's schools. But if we have schools that are overtaxed, and this isn't just something with Milford, this is schools everywhere right now, it's very difficult if we're not addressing the needs of the staff as well to be looking at the mental health of the students. And so I think that that is a concern. What are we doing for the students in our schools? We have a really great social emotional learning initiative. I know it's part of the district strategic plan as well as the different school improvement plans, but all of the efforts we have are based on typical developmental trajectory. They don't take into account kids who have been wearing masks for 2 years. How do you teach empathy to kids who can't see the emotions of others? That's a new challenge. And I don't think anyone has those answers yet, but it's something that I'm thinking about. And I don't think any of us know what that is going to do for our children in the future. But I think it's something we just need to be aware of and constantly be mindful of. Another problem, and not necessarily due to anyone's fault, it's, again, we are in the middle of an unprecedented time, is that parents haven't had the same access to the schools as they have in the past. It broke my heart the other day when I actually realized my daughter's in second grade and she's never had a field trip. I just hadn't really thought about that. But the opportunities to have a field trip for parents to volunteer in the schools, I haven't been able to do that since she was in kindergarten. And, I'm just one parent, but I look at different ways that parents are involved and I think to myself, how can we increase those opportunities? How can we make sure the parents whose first language isn't English have the same opportunities as a parent who does? So really getting the schools to be a place that they're the pillars of our community. So how do we make the community collaborate with the teachers, with the administrators? I just think it'll make us stronger. And then the third thing that I would say is really a balancing act, if you will. So increasing educational opportunities for our students. When I worked with the 8th grade, one of the most challenging pieces for me was seeing students apply to BVT who would really benefit from vocational opportunities be denied access. So, that's one example, but there's multiple of different opportunities I would love to see for our students. And when I say a balancing act, I say that because we have to look at space. And so really thinking about what can we increase while managing the space restraints that we currently have, I would say, in my mind, are the three most pressing issues.
I hadn't even thought about field trips. My youngest has always said that she was emotionally scarred because she remembers I missed a field trip. And I was like, wait a minute. First grade to high school, I never missed a field trip. I went on every single one. She said, nope, you missed one.
And she remembered.
But see, that's the funny part.
It leaves an impact.
And when I think back, and we'll explore, parents who don't understand English. I was always so proud that when something happened at school, my dad would put on his hat, put on his suit, and show up. Had no clue as to what they were saying, what they were doing. But somebody told him, you have to support your son, you have to go to these events. And somehow he would show up with my mom. And I don't think anybody ever really thinks the kids notice. But boy, do we ever.
Absolutely. It makes a huge difference. So just making sure all families, all kids have the opportunity to see their parents, all parents are given access. And, there's a variety of different thoughts that I have about that, but just factors to consider. So language, but also just how much can we make things available for parents at different times of day, for parents who work, just to make sure every parent is able to be a part of that, because you're right, those are the things you remember, and we want every child to have that opportunity as well as every parent to too.
Yeah, because, here I am, 65 years old, and I'm remembering 50 years ago plus that my parents always came to the events, even though I knew they had no idea what was going on.
Yeah, but that didn't matter, right? It was
No,
just that
they were there. They showed up.
Exactly.
And how they did it, I'll never know, because they both worked. But somehow they found a way, and it left an impression, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely.
Talk to me about the whole access to BVT.
Yeah.
Because that one is kind of a point that I've brought up over and over. For people like my dad, who came to this country, put him in an organic chemistry class. Academically, he wouldn't do well. Give the man a tool. He was an artist. But yet, for somebody like him, he'd never get into BVT.
Right. And so, we do have obviously a good number of students who do end up deciding to go to BVT every year, but then we also have many other students who apply and are not given access. And so what are their options? And I think the more that we can expand what we have in-house, because we can't control what BVT does, right? We can't control who they're admitting necessarily, but what we can do is look at what are the programs we have, what are the opportunities we can offer. And part of that goes along with what I was saying about engaging with families and communities, because trying to balance the space issue. So one thought, I know that there is a career counselor at the high school now. I actually recently did a presentation myself through the National Association of School Psychologists. There is an initiative to bring about more culturally and linguistically diverse school psychologists. And so I actually presented at Milford High School recently on the field of school psychology. And so I had the opportunity to talk to the career counselor a little bit, and just thinking, in the community, I'd mentioned to her that how many internship opportunities could be possible. So that way, is it something we could think about? And she said, yes, we're definitely looking at thinking more internal and external. And then I get really excited. And so I started saying, for early childhood, they could walk over to Brookside. I don't know if that's an option, but just really trying to be creative and think outside of the box. What are things we could do to give more opportunities to our students that wouldn't necessarily require more space, and that would maybe in some ways help the other schools as well? Can we team vertically throughout the district to be thinking about what options we can give all of our students? So that's just an idea. I know that the high school currently has the building trades program, and so how could we possibly expand upon that as well? And just so many different things I think are possible if we're willing to have the discussion.
And we have to be careful because we can't compete with BVT.
Right. Oh,
But-
yes. And that wouldn't be fair to ask Milford to do that either, right? Because we are not a vocational high school. And, they are the program that our town
We
connects
pay our
with.
fair share to
Yes,
send our kids there.
exactly. So, yes, no, absolutely. I don't think it would be fair by any stretch of the imagination to say that we want to compare Milford High School, which is really more holistic in many ways because it offers everything, to a school that is specializing in any one area, but just also being mindful of the opportunities we want to give our own students.
Yeah, and you can't take away from what Dr. Fitz has done there.
Yes. No, I mean, it is a beautiful school. I used to love touring it when I was with the 8th grade. That was one of my favorite days, was getting to go over there as a special education team chairperson. I get to ask questions about how they consider students with IEPs, and different types of accommodations for interviews, things of that nature. So, no, it's a phenomenal school, and, it's beautiful facilities, and the variety of options are just wonderful. The one thing that I wish for it was that more students would be able to have that opportunity who wanted it. And at the same time, if students want to be able to stay in their home high school, I just want to make sure there's opportunities for them there as well.
Well, that's been one thing that the FinCom has always been consistent on. It's the FinCom's job to grunt and growl and save money. But there's been a clear message to BVT that we'll never complain about our contribution going up if it's because you took more Milford kids.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I love what they've done there, the academic program, everything. But I feel bad for the kids who are just below the cutoff.
Yep, me too.
You know, and I'd love to see more programs like hotel
Mm-hmm.
management or
Yeah.
the bank in the middle of the school
Yep.
and
Yeah.
things like that.
They're teaching skills too. So that, that is phenomenal. And that's really what our students need.
Explain to me what a school psychologist is and does.
Yeah. Oh,
Because
I would love
you're
to.
talking about it, and
Yeah.
I may be one of the people who have assumptions,
Mm-hmm.
but aren't quite accurate.
Yeah. So, without getting into my entire spiel about what a school psychologist is, essentially, school psychologists are trained to provide comprehensive students services to students. So, one of the things that I think school psychologists are often thought about is they provide psychological evaluations. So, if a student is referred for special education, they'll be the ones to do the testing, but they do more than that. They can provide direct counseling to students. They'll do groups. So it could be something like a social skills group or a friendship group, or, a group if you have parents who got divorced recently and they asked for their kids to be in a group together, things like that. They can do consultation with parents, teachers, other school personnel, and they also do a lot of work with interventions. So the tailoring of behavioral interventions, academic interventions, collecting data, and then, more overall universal social emotional learning programming. So really, school psychologists can be involved in all facets of the educational experience. And in the state of Massachusetts, it's a pre-K through 12 license. So anyone who's trained in the field should have a good grasp of all the developmental levels.
But what is the ultimate goal?
Yep, of a school psychologist. So I think it depends day to day. So in general, if the question is why do we have one in the school, it's to be able to provide really a spectrum of mental health services. So to identify kids who might need more help, to know that this child needs to have an IEP, they need to have more help, so they're part of that team, to determine, this student isn't, maybe they could work with a reading interventionist to say, this child's not making progress in reading, let's figure out why. They provide direct counseling. If a teacher, when I was a school psychologist, a lot of times teachers would just not know how to work with a student. And so they'd come to talk to me and ask me questions. If I had strategies to help them, I'd go observe in the class. And so really all different aspects. I'd consult to administration. So you kind of have your hands in everything.
Is it harder in a school like Milford, where we're so diverse and we face such a gamut of questions and issues?
So I will say the one thing that was difficult for me personally working in Milford was, and this is something that if I ever were to come back to Milford, I would want to work on myself professionally, is the fact that I'm not bilingual. And so that's also the reason why I am part of that recruitment program to try to recruit future school psychologists who are. And the reason why it's difficult is if I'm in a counseling session with a student, or if they're disclosing something really traumatic, I now have to bring in a third-party interpreter who, and I don't know how much of that's being lost. I don't know, imagine trying to talk to a counselor and really disclose something, and you need to talk through an interpreter. So that was, for me, as a professional, challenging. So had I not gone into the team chair role, I think I would have started to try to learn at least enough basic conversational things in Portuguese and Spanish to be able to communicate on a very, very, very elementary level with students, to just have something.
Yeah, but even trying, when I've seen the impact of teachers who maybe don't have the full linguistic skills in a language like Portuguese, but if you're trying, there seems to be a trust.
Yeah, I think so. And I wouldn't say, working, other than that, that was the only thing that I think, the diversity of Milford was challenging for me, was that I couldn't always communicate directly with the students and with their parents in the way that I wanted to. Other than that, though, you have to really understand the students who are in front of you. It's quite funny. Like sometimes I would work with a student and I would hear, oh, they're a troublemaker. They're not gonna, they don't want to do anything, this and that. And then I'd meet with the student and just after a couple minutes, and especially with eighth graders, it's hard to develop trust right away when they don't know you. And I've had more than one occasion where I looked at a student and I just said, it's 9 o'clock in the morning. You haven't really talked to anyone yet. You've been here a couple hours. Did you eat breakfast today? And how often they would just look at me and be like, why are you asking me that? And I'd say, because I'm going to walk you down to get a muffin if you didn't. And right there, now I have a connection with that kid. So just being willing to kind of understand, the diversity of our population, understanding that some kids in this district might not have had breakfast this morning. A lot of kids might not have. So can that be a factor? Just being willing to ask those questions, I think, makes anyone in a more diverse district better at their job.
Well, we're getting to the point where it's almost 50% of the kids are on free lunch, free
Mm-hmm.
breakfast.
Yep. And, that's and it's funny too, like when we're saying that, and this is why I bring up breakfast, because and this goes back to communicating with families, I would find two issues. One, families sometimes didn't even know how to fill out those forms appropriately, so they would need help with that. And two, a lot of individuals don't realize when you qualify for free lunch that you get free breakfast too. And so I would see many students who didn't realize that they had that access. And so just even making kids aware of that, families aware of that, it can make a difference, because that's one more meal that they're getting that they weren't otherwise.
Well, and I think a lot of it is destigmatizing,
Oh, absolutely.
because, well, I'm a poor kid if I have to ask for food, or my child shouldn't have to go outside the house.
I gotta say, I love the fact that with the COVID relief funds, all the schools have been getting universal free breakfast and lunch. I really like that, because there is no stigma. Everyone just has it. And so I do think that's nice. And so if we go back to, though it depends, if Milford does get above 50%, they did approve that districts that have a majority of students on free or reduced lunch can qualify for universal. So, I mean, if that happens, that would be wonderful.
We're getting close.
To just have it I think that would be ideal. But, if not, how can we work as a community to make sure that there's not stigma around that no one should feel embarrassed about needing to eat?
It's funny, when we grew up, you never knew. When I moved back to Milford, because I was born and raised, left for 10 years, gravitational pull brought me right back home. I started hearing about areas of Milford that were better than others.
Yep.
And it totally shocked me.
Yep.
Wait a minute, Woodland to Brookside to Memorial isn't a mile apart.
Right.
So, when they're talking about socioeconomic effects, I'm like,
Yeah.
wait a minute. We all grew up.
Right. We didn't. So it's interesting. So I grew up in Milford. So my mom actually lives on the same property my great grandparents came to. So, my family's been here for quite a while. And, but my dad.
So you're a Milfordian.
I am a little bit, but not.
Third generation.
Fourth generation.
Well,
yeah.
you got to be 3 generations.
Yep.
And live within 2 miles of your mother.
So I don't know if it's quite 2 miles, but it's pretty close, because we're both in Milford, just on different sides. But what's interesting, so, it was really special for my dad that I earned my PhD. He himself didn't go to college. He actually worked at what was Mass Electric, became National Grid. And so it was, really important for him that my brother and I received as much education as we could. We went through Milford through 12th grade and then went to higher education. But when I was a kid, it was my younger brother and I, and then I had 2 older brothers, and it was my dad supporting all 6 of us, including my mom. And so I was a reduced lunch kid. I remember that back in the day. And it wasn't a big deal. Nobody necessarily said anything then, but I think now some kids might feel that stigma. And so how do we make sure that they don't? And how do we make sure every single child's in Milford? I know getting a PhD isn't the option for everyone, but I did. I went through Milford schools. My dad didn't go to college himself, and then I was able to get a doctorate. So I want to make sure any child who perhaps wants that path has that option as well. So yes, the vocational track is important, but we want to make sure we're also pushing the kids who are college bound too.
Well, that's always been, I decided not to go for a PhD because I started working at Waters and just fell in love with the business world. But there is a special feeling that my daughter is 3/4 of the way to getting her PhD in education to help kids.
Yep. That's pretty amazing.
My dad came over from Portugal. He had done his 4 years in school, because that's what you got in the villages. You got 4 years.
Yep.
And then went to work.
Then you're on your own. Yeah.
And I was the first one to go to college. And it always amazed me because, when you talk about being a free lunch kid, well, my mother worked at Draper's, making a whopping $11,000 a year. My father was on the fast track. He was at General Motors making 18. You know, but somehow, it always amazed me when it came down to school.
Yep.
They had the money to send me to Holy Cross. I didn't have to take out loans, and
That's great.
that was $6,000 a year, which is nothing now.
But then,
but when you're making 11,
yep.
you know, it was so important to them that the whole life was around the kids.
Yep.
And you know, you hear about kids who don't speak English are at this huge disadvantage. I'm glad nobody told us. Because I remember leaving the house the first time and saying, what are these kids? They don't understand language? Because I was speaking Portuguese. That's all I really knew.
Yeah, of course.
And these kids were all speaking this English language.
You're like, what is this?
But somehow it all came
Yep.
together. You know, and you look at terms like you used IEP. What's an IEP?
Yeah, so I'm happy to talk about that. So, an IEP is an individualized education program, and so it's developed for children who are in special education. So, any child who qualifies, having a disability, and then is determined to need essentially services to help them make substantial progress in school receives an individualized plan. And so Milford does a really good job with its special education programming, pre-K all the way through both, I would say 12th grade, but actually it continues until you're 22 in the state of Massachusetts, depending on your needs. So, so an IEP would be, the plan that's created for kids within special
We
education.
need a little customized care.
Yeah, so and again, it's only for students with disabilities, but it's to really provide them what they need to access the curriculum. And so it's, if we look at what should a student in 5th grade be able to do reasonably, some kids just need a little more support to get there. What's really nice, though, too, is, there's initiatives, I know, within the district when I was here, too, and that have continued on for you don't have to just be, though, in special education to get any support. So yes, for an IEP and special education, you do need to have a disability. But even within general education, that's why we talk about a multi-tiered systems of supports, because not every child in general education is going to only need the classroom teacher's instruction, right? That's why we hire reading interventionists. That's why we have math interventionists. So we really need to look at just the needs of all kids, no matter kind of who they are or where they're at.
How do you answer people who say, we're spending too much money on special needs? Because a lot of people are coming from other towns to take advantage of our special needs program.
Yeah, so I think that we should take that as a compliment if people want to come from other towns to be part of our programming, right? So, thinking about what is it that we offer? And when I answer this question, too, it almost kind of bleeds into a question maybe about MCAS. So when we're thinking about the students that we keep in-house in our district, if we keep more students and we are saying, they're our kids, we want to educate them. And if you see our program and you think that it works for your kids, too, a kid's a kid. Even if they're from down the street or within our town, they're kids that deserve an education. And if we're the best place to give it to them, that's a wonderful compliment to us. But then, some naysayers may say, well, let's look at our MCAS scores for the high needs population and for the students with disabilities population. And I say, hey, we're keeping our kids in district. If you compare student by disability type within Milford to different districts, and then you use that to look at MCAS scores, you're going to see, you can't just, it's not like you're comparing apples to apples, right? Milford does not look the same as other districts in terms of, what our population is, and then in terms of test scores, and then, yes, as well as possibly special education funding. But I think that's something to be proud of, personally.
Well, I've always said we set up programs for our kids. If along the way of taking care of our 4,500 kids, we help some others, I don't think I feel bad about that.
Right. No, that's definitely not something to feel bad about. I just think the more that we can help every child, right, that's a good thing. We want to help as many kids as we can.
Now, you talk about MCAS scores. People will come and say, well, Milford's MCAS results are worse than a lot of towns around us. How do you answer that?
Yeah, again, we're not comparing apples to apples here. So I would say let's really break down the MCAS scores. Let's look at them for possibly different demographics of students. If we're looking at just our kids that are in the highest honors level, AP level class, how are they doing? And now if we look at our kids who are more high needs, how are they doing? And really kind of comparing it that way. I remember actually, and I will talk about my own ignorance too. When I was working in the schools, I didn't initially know, just coming in, working in the schools, that students who have only been in the country for 2 years are expected to take MCAS and have those scores count. I couldn't believe that. You're just learning the language. Language acquisition doesn't happen overnight. So one of the biggest things, and this goes back to my training as a school psychologist, like I said, school psychologist, we love data, we like assessments, but I want to know what the assessment is measuring. And so if you tell me that this is a test designed to measure science, math, and ELA scores, and what it's actually measuring is how well the student has
Language comprehension.
gained, yes, the language, English language. And I also would be interested, as an aside too, to think, is there any cultural loading in this test too? When we're asking English language questions, would somebody who's new to the country, even if they can speak the English language, would they be confused because of how we ask questions? So that's something that we look at too. Sometimes there'll be a reference that you would only really know if you were raised here. And so, I mean, for our ELL population, I think we need to really be somewhat critical of what the scores are, because again, what are we measuring? Are we measuring their ELA abilities, their math abilities, their science abilities, or are we measuring language acquisition and understanding of the American culture? And I don't really have that
Well,
answer.
I remember walking in and poking the bear. There was a fellow named Tommy Daverin.
Yeah, he was my principal.
He was a lot of people, but he took incredible pride in Middle School East. That was his, and those kids were his. So one day I walked in, I said, Tommy, why do your MCAS scores suck? And he looked at me without even blinking and said, because you're ignorant. I said, okay, educate me. And he pointed out exactly what you said. We do not have a homogeneous population.
No.
Instead of one big Gaussian curve, we have two bell curves. And he looked at me straight in the eye and said, I'll put our top kids up against any town around us and we won't come out short. But you got kids who are learning the language.
Yes.
You know, and even, you know, it's funny because unless you've lived it, it's hard to explain Portuguese. I don't speak Portuguese. I speak a Luso, an Americanized Portuguese. My mother speaks an Americanized Portuguese. So there's words that when we had exchange students from Brazil, I remember one time when I said, I got to pay my taxes, Bernardo looked at me and said, why? I said, because you go to jail if you don't. He goes, but you live in Massachusetts. Now, to any of us, we know taxes are taxes.
Yeah.
No, imposts. That you're taking words and like pale. Well, I learned pale is pelu. That means fur. But to anybody in Milford, if you said, vai buscar o pelo, go get a pail, they know exactly what.
Yeah.
So it's like double
Yeah.
hard sometimes to these kids because even when they're taught Portuguese, depending on like Brazilian Portuguese, I do well when I go to Northeast Brazil. I go to Rio, I'm in trouble. You know, it's like the famous line is bom dia. D-I-A, dia, not Gia. But down there it's Gia.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of words that even when you're being taught Portuguese
Are different. Yeah, so I took Milford High School, 4 years of Spanish, and then I went to Barcelona, where the Spanish is actually a little bit different.
Yeah.
So, so that's a much smaller example, but you're right. And so we have kids, and it's not as simple as saying they speak Portuguese, get them a Portuguese translation, because even if we do, maybe that's not sufficient.
Yeah,
So
the silliest thing was, I'll never forget, my French teacher at Middle School East. No, it was at Stacy. It was at Stacy, Marie Longo. Oh my God. I came back when we moved to Milford. And she said, excuse me, do you remember what you said to me when you left? That you would never need French? Why are you bothering with French? Where did you just move back from? I said, Paris. And how do you remember 30 years ago? But
that's amazing.
it just showed you how much the professionals,
Yeah,
the educational staff kid. How could she remember one kid?
right. But she
But
did.
she did.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if somebody was to ask you, can I get a good
Mm-hmm.
education for my kids in Milford? How would you answer?
Absolutely. And you just touched upon the reason why. It's the people that we have. So we have educators here who love what they're doing. Like we said, there's some challenges that we have as a district that we need to think about that other districts might not necessarily be faced with. And yet we have educators who are showing up every day who want to be part of that, who want to be here for our kids. That's why they're here and that's why they're teaching. So absolutely, because of the people we have working in this district for our children, I have no doubt that they would get a wonderful education.
People worry that putting their kids, and let's face it, I had the most beautiful, brilliant, talented, they're my kids,
Right, of
you
course.
know, you can't compare.
Yep,
So that's going to always be my biased view.
of course.
But, people will say, well, if you're putting them in with kids who don't speak English,
Mm-hmm.
who are behind the curve,
Mm-hmm.
won't that hurt their education?
So, yeah, and you hear those things, and it is sometimes a little frustrating to hear those things too, because I think that that's taking, one view of education that, over time we've seen just really isn't accurate. And so, really the more people that they're exposed to, the more diversity, the better. It helps children to see different perspectives. It helps the children to learn empathy at a different rate. So those skills that we're really building on, it is beneficial and it helps them. So the more diverse the students, I think the better. It's really nice. I want my daughter to meet people who are all different from her in all different ways so that she realizes that's what life is. It is about people being different from you. Not everyone's going to be exactly the same, and that's a great thing. And I do think, our teachers do a really great job, even within a general education classroom, differentiating instruction. So, making sure, even though students are learning at different rates, that those high-achieving kids are still being challenged. And so, I know my daughter has only been in the Milford Public Schools for a few years because she's in second grade, but having worked at the middle school level, as well as seeing her teachers, every teacher I've worked with does a fantastic job at that, at really understanding within one classroom of, say, 22 odd kids, every one of those 22 is going to have a different need, and how do I address that? And everyone does a really good job at that.
And I like that you mentioned our top kids.
Mm-hmm.
Because to me, those are special needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when we talk about exceptionalities, we're often thinking about either children with special education or the students we would previously call gifted. And so students who are more high achieving. And so that is important that we don't forget about them. And I don't think we have. So just looking at the AP offerings at the high school, the fact that you can get college credit as a high school student is very exciting. I was actually looking through some of the courses in the high school catalog, and again, my bias, I was very excited that students could get college credit in psychology. And I thought, wow, that is wonderful. This is definitely the way to go. Maybe we will get some future school psychologists out of here after all. But yeah, I think, do a really nice job, again, of balance, just meeting the needs of all of our students, no matter where they're at, because everyone's a part of this community, and we need to match
Well,
it
it's
all.
come so far because the first year of the high school, the end of 73, 74, there were 3 kids who ran out of science courses. And the only thing, we were fortunate to have Uncle Paul Raftery,
Mm-hmm.
who loved all the kids in the high
Mm-hmm.
school equally. And he banished us to Franklin. He sent us to Dean Junior College to pick up biology and chemistry.
That's pretty out of the box thinking, though. That's great that he did that.
Back then.
Yeah, that's
We
wonderful.
had no idea. He just
Yeah.
came and said, okay, you're going to go to another school for 2 days a week.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And we were like, why? We like Milford High.
Yeah, are we in trouble? What is
Yeah,
this?
exactly. What did we do wrong?
Yeah.
But no, he got somehow the funding, the leverage,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. But 3 of us took biology and chemistry. The kids now can do that in the school.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and that's wonderful. So I love seeing that, and I hope that that's something that we'll be able to continue the different partnerships with local colleges to increase that.
We took, a few years ago, a controversial move where we created security inside the high school and inside all the schools with our own specialized SWAT team. What do you think?
Of having security inside the schools. So I think, and thinking of like the school resource officers and those types of roles.
Well, what happened was somebody came up with an idea where they said, Milford Town is part of a regional SWAT program. And the SWAT team can be in Milford within 42 minutes of an event. But almost every event's over in 18. So we kind of looked at each other because it was a lot of money. It was $600,000. And I remember looking at the chairman at that time, Chris Moore, and saying, God help us if we turn this down
And something happens.
and something happens. How could I look at a mom or a dad and say, and I am conservative. I don't like spending money. But how could I look and say I spent that much money and it didn't stop somebody from harming your child? So now we have, again, I'm not supposed to call them SWAT officers, but they know the schools.
Yep,
They
yep.
roam the schools.
Yep. So having school resource officers, I think, so I worked closely with the school resource officer, and that was more as the adjustment counselor part of my role when I was at Middle School East. So I think that can be a really important role in the schools. There's, different schools have different models. What I think works best, though, is when you have an officer who has some type of partnership with ideally an adjustment counselor or a school social worker, because then there were lots of times where I was so thankful for that presence. If I needed to do a wellness check at a student's home, I could have them take me and I felt safe as a school employee. There were times where I had a student who unfortunately was at risk of self-harm and had to go to the hospital, and the resource officer could take me there. So I think that there is a lot of utility for that. And then if we ever had an instance where, of course, there was a safety concern, it is nice to know that presence is available.
Like I say, I voted for it because I couldn't imagine looking at a parent saying I didn't do everything. They say, I got 4,500 kids. I didn't do everything I could to protect every one of them. We would be remiss at this time not to talk about COVID-19.
Okay.
I've stayed away from it because everywhere we go, that's all you hear.
Yep.
Are we doing the right thing?
Yeah, so COVID-19 is tough. And thus far, the school committee, the district, the superintendent really has taken the guidance from the state. And so, the Department of Education and Governor Baker have really put out different requirements throughout time, shifting different expectations. And I think that as a district, we've really been, following the lead of what the state's been doing. So, up to this point, I don't think there's anything we really could have done differently since we've been taking the lead of the state. I do appreciate as a parent when I get the emails that kind of give the updates from the superintendent's office as well as from the schools. And I've noticed too, at least, speaking as a parent at Brookside, it is nice how often we'll get a superintendent update and then the principal will respond kind of how, so it's like, this is the overall picture and then this is how it's going to apply at our school. And I do appreciate that communication. So yeah, I think, kind of staying up to date on what the governor's saying, what the Department of Education is, and then following suit from there. It'll be interesting to see how things evolve in the next few weeks. But yeah, I think
We've been saying that for 2 years.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I agree with you because it's good to hear from Kevin McIntyre about the state of the union, the district.
Yep.
But if I've got a kid at the high school, I want to hear about what Josh is telling me about the high school.
Yeah. And what I've noticed in the communications that I do appreciate is you can tell that the administrators are aligned. They're on the same page. So I think that is a nice approach where we hear from Kevin as kind of our leader, and then we hear from the school principals. At least that's how I've seen it from Brookside, because it shows that they're on the same page, and I appreciate that.
Simplistically, it's like the morning shows.
Yeah.
You hear about the Great Plains and the weather and
Exactly.
Okay, enough of that. Give me the 30 seconds
the
about
local.
Milford.
Yep, exactly. Yep, I agree.
It seems like the state is starting to understand more and more the resources needed in a town like Milford. When you talk about 50% of the kids being on free lunch, frankly, I'm amazed that I think that's like 30 grand or 34 grand for a family of four. My hat's off to how people can make it on that. But the last couple years, and this year especially, we got a $7 million bump in Chapter 70. That's the money the state, but a lot of parents don't understand that that's the state contribution. And for years, we've been hovering at 47% of the total cost was borne by the state. The last 2-3 years, it's really ramping up. This year, $7 million, the state's going to outpace the town's contribution.
That's pretty wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, you look 10 years back.
Yeah.
If you look over 10 years, I think this year we may cross over.
Wow.
But your mind, if you're the king or the queen with the magic wand, what would you look to change? What would you look to improve?
So, and I know that this isn't necessarily going to come from the Chapter 70 funding. It's something we're going to have to wait further down the road to get additional assistance. But like I said at the very beginning, we need more space. So we have more students coming into this district, and that is a wonderful thing. But we need room for our district to grow. I am always an advocate too, along with the space, is adding more individuals who are directly interfacing with our students. So teachers, nurses, counselors, school psychologists. But again, that takes space. If we have more teachers, we need more classrooms. So I think if I had a magic wand, I would have all the funding in the world for us to, build or modify or renovate whatever we need to. But I think that from a financial perspective will be one of, in the upcoming years, things that we really do need to be thinking about.
Well, hopefully, people forget. I've gotten beaten up a lot for saying we're putting money away in stabilization. And they say, why do you keep putting money away? There's a school coming. We just did a school. Yeah, but we've got 5 schools in Milford. If the average lifespan is 40 to 50 years, it means one school every 10 years. And we just got to keep planning. Any thoughts on the new high school?
Yeah, so I think once we are able to get approved for more grant funding around that, that's something we're definitely going to need to work on. I am not an engineer myself, but I remember being in that building, and it is a sturdy building. And so from my standpoint, I think it would make sense to renovate as opposed to rebuild. I also don't necessarily know what we would do with all the kids if we wanted to rebuild. So that's something that because it's not like we can just build a high school in the summer, right? As much as we might want to. So, I have a lot of ideas, which one thing that's really, really nice about school committee is that there are 7 people. So everyone is bringing in a different perspective, which I think is really nice. But, one question I would want to ask if we were renovating the high school is, do we want to try to make it large enough to incorporate the 8th grade? I'm not sure how popular of an opinion that would be, but if we were able to bring them up, that might, release some of the pressure that the other schools are having with their numbers. I think we might have to be completely mindful about what all the grades would look like at the district if that was the option that we took. But I think it's something that's worth a conversation, especially as the younger buildings are increasing in numbers. I remember when I was at Memorial myself, we had these things called the portables across the street.
They're coming back.
Yeah. So, but I remember being a kid and hoping against all hope I wouldn't be in the portables because they were across the street. So I think having modular classrooms makes sense if that's, what we need. I just hope we're mindful of, where they go, because you don't want any second graders scared of crossing the street like I myself was back in 1992. But yeah, so I think, how can we be creative? How can we use other solutions for now is something we'll need to think about. But yeah, the high school, that's going to need to come.
What you said is profound, because people forgot that originally when the Brookside project was brought up, a few of us asked the question saying, how are you going to build and have kids in the building? And as it turns out, we couldn't.
Can't.
So we ended up building half a school by adding on to Memorial and adding on to the high school. And that was for 300 kids. You sit there and say, okay, we got 1,200,
Yeah, at the high school.
1,300.
Yep. You can't just
Where would you put them?
Yeah, you can't just put them other places. That wouldn't work.
You know,
so.
and the idea of a new school, I don't think people really understand that, first of all, where would we put it?
Right.
You know, everybody says, oh, we go up to Asylum Street. Can you imagine running all those buses up 140?
Mm-hmm.
Or through, you know, the Ridgewood area?
Mm-hmm. Or if you have kids that are walkers, I don't want them walking on 140. You know, that would be right.
You just couldn't.
Yeah.
You know, number one, but you sit there and say there's got to be a way. And we all love the pool at the high school.
Mm-hmm.
We love the auditorium
Mm-hmm.
and the square footage per pupil.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we don't have enough space.
Right.
But all the new SBA rules, the school building administration rules, they won't pay for a new pool.
Mm-hmm.
They won't pay for an auditorium. And that's why Woodland has, was it cafetorium?
Yep.
My hat's off to Aldo and Jonathan Bruce
Yep.
for coming up with, you know, creative ideas.
Creative solutions are good, but it's nice to be able to preserve what we already have that's working nicely for us.
So it looks like we're going to have to do something because realistically, and this is just my opinion, it doesn't matter. Once the high school is done, the day after, we're going to say, there's a school coming,
Mm-hmm. Of course.
and probably Stacy's the next one in line.
Yep.
But you can't really add a lot of geography to Stacy.
Yeah. So that's part of why I think if we were able to move the 8th grade up to the high school, that might create more options. But I don't know. I guess
Well,
we'll have
no,
to
but
see.
what you're saying makes a lot of sense, to add space.
Yeah.
How you add space, whether it's take the courtyard over or whether it's go up 2 levels,
Right.
that's for engineers.
Exactly.
That's why we pay people to be engineers.
Exactly. Those are for folks above my pay grade.
But the need is there. And building it so that you can have 8th grade into a high school complex really would eliminate a lot of the crowding at Stacy
I
and
agree.
buy us the 10 years, because we won't be able to touch it again.
Right.
You know, you start thinking about, if the high school goes well, we're going to add $7 million of expense. Now,
It's a lot.
I'm all for doing everything we can for the kids. But you got to balance it with people like your mom and dad. You know, a lot of our seniors who built this town are living on $1,500 a month Social Security. You can't just go add, because every million adds $80. So adding $400 or $500 can mean the difference of a senior having dinner tonight or not.
And so that's one of the things I think about too. And I think it's really important as school committee. Yes, we are here for the school, here for the kids, of course. I wouldn't be running if that wasn't my top priority. But you're also elected by this town. You're representing the town. And so, you know, my daughter, first and foremost, most important person in my world, right? Just, I think that
Yes.
goes. I don't necessarily want to fund her schools at the cost of my 75-year-old mother, who is a property owner in Milford, right? So, you know, I am very much a fan of, let's get the state to help us as much as we can. Let's make sure we are really looking into all the different grants that are available to us. And are there some too that, and I, you know, wouldn't necessarily know all of the answers to this either, but are there different ones that we're not tapping into yet that perhaps, given our population and the diversity, that would be options for us? So, yeah, I think absolutely. Let's do as much as we can for the kids and get someone else to pay for it.
I agree. I mean, the fact when we heard we were going to get at least $7 million extra, it made it
It's exciting.
exciting because the school had come back. And the problem is, you're not arguing with the school committee over the need. You know, when they came back and said, even last year we had a big increase. This year we need 9% more. My heart stops as to where are we going to find 9% increase?
Yeah.
6-point-something million extra dollars.
Right.
Now, luckily, I mean, it's an annual ritual. The school says they need $9 billion extra. The finance committee cries we're broke.
Yep.
And somewhere in the 2 months,
You meet the middle.
you meet and you say, okay, what we really can afford. If we get more, you get more.
Yep.
But I'm tickled pink that the state finally realized that gateway towns, because they look at the gateway cities. You know, we've got a state rep who's really hammering home, Brian Murray's really hammering home that Milford may not be a gateway city, but it's a gateway town.
Yeah,
And we got a lot of the same problems as a New Bedford, a Fall River.
absolutely.
So we spend a lot more per kid.
Mm-hmm.
Luckily, they're funding it. And I hope they keep funding it for a couple more years so that we can keep expanding and helping out the school committee.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that it's a really wonderful thing that the state is seeing this. And so what can we do to be proactive to continue to get that funding?
And we can never forget, years ago when we went through the trough in funding, I read about towns around us delaying their raises. The union, and this is something you never read about, the Milford Teachers Union came to the FinCom and said, we'll forego our raise. If you promise us, you'll fight, because we have no power, but you will fight to keep that money in the school system to save teachers.
That's pretty amazing.
It was the union that brought that up. How can you not,
Right.
feel good about?
Yeah. What does that say about what a community our schools are? That we're looking out for each other, our teachers are. And so, you got to think, anyone who goes into education, they're doing it because they care, that they want to help kids. And so if they're willing to do that for each other, how much are they willing to go out for our
They're not doing it
kids?
for the $1 million salaries?
Right. Yes. Yes. I think you would have a rude awakening if that's why you went into education. But yeah, the fact they're willing to advocate for each other that way just makes me feel very comfortable with what they're doing for our kids.
Robyn, I'm from Milford. Why should I vote for you?
Yeah, thank you. So hopefully everything I said provided an overview of who I am, why I'm running for school committee, and what I hope to accomplish. But at the end of the day, like I said at the very beginning, and I'll say at the very end, I'm a mom. I'm a parent, and I want what's best for my child. I firmly believe that if something isn't good enough for her, it's not good enough for any child at all. So, I want the opportunity to be a voice for all families, for all parents, for all kids, to use my education and my experience as a form of service as a member of the Milford School Committee.
Well, thank you. And thank you especially for being one of the few who not only have an opinion, but are willing to put up sweat equity to make it happen.
Thanks.
And as always, I'll never ask you to vote for a specific candidate, not my place, but I'll beg you to learn about these candidates and get out and make sure you vote. Find a candidate that talks and does the things you believe in. Because we have 4,500 kids we have to take care of. And this is the first step. Remember, that vote, you're saying, Robyn or whoever, I trust you to guide 6 hours a day of my child's life. And the future. Because Uncle Paul Raftery, to a lot of us, he took the time and he influenced a lot of lives, mine included. Because what I learned there carried me forward. I don't know if that's good, but... So again, to our 6 loyal viewers, please vote. And may God bless, and may tomorrow be a better night than tonight. Good night, and thank you. And thank you.
Thank you.
Far too long since I've been home. Been running all my life just